Take a look at this fastball and tell me what you think of it. Consider the movement of the pitch, maybe the velocity, Cease's slot, and compare that to this four-seam fastball. Rhett Lauder has a much lower slot than Cease, the pitch runs a bit more to the arm side, and you can maybe tell it's a bit slower as well. Cease's fastball is a lot better than Rhett Lauder's, but why? This raises an essential question in projecting the success of a major league starting pitcher. What actually makes a good fastball? Velocity is the most obvious starting point. The average four-seam fastball thrown by a major league starting pitcher is 94.6 miles per hour this season, and that has increased a full 2 miles per hour from 2017. The league's half-mile per hour jump between last year and this year is the biggest we've seen since we started tracking velocity. And therein lies most of our answer, but it's also the least interesting part. The movement of a fastball is really important. Organizations use what is called short-form movement to track how a pitch breaks from a pitcher's hand to the plate. You might be familiar with these plots, which are charting the vertical and horizontal movement of any given pitch. Now, they're not charting the location, which I think people seeing them for the first time have a tough time separating out. The way I like to explain it is to use any third-person video game where you see the trajectory of your aim. The angle at which the pitcher releases the ball sets that red line, and then the break is measured off that trajectory. So when you hear that phrase, this slider backed up, it usually didn't mean the pitch was actually moving to the right. It's just the trajectory out of the pitcher's hand was different, and the ball's movement is usually similar. There's some more nuance to how location affects short form movement, but I'm going to keep it this simple for now. The average four-seam fastball thrown by a righty has 16 inches of vertical break and 8 inches of movement to the pitcher's arm side. This movement is heavily influenced by 4 factors that really get into the nitty-gritty of fastball quality. The first one I'm going to talk about is arm angle. The average arm angle in MLB is 40 degrees, your classic 3/4 slot. Raise your arm angle to 50 degrees, and the average four-seamer adds an inch of vertical break, and it loses 2 inches of arm side movement. Lower your slot to 30 degrees, and you'll lose 1 inch of vertical break, but gain 2 inches of arm side movement. Number 2 is one of the most important variables in understanding the fingerprint of a pitcher, spin efficiency. I like to think of this as the natural tendency of how your hand moves through release. This bird's eye view is one that I've used in prior videos. I think it's the best way to kind of display what we're talking about with this percentage. 100% spin efficiency is pure backspin. That kind of looks like this. The average in Major League Baseball among four-seamers is 91%, or some very subtle cut relative to that 100% efficient pitch. Combine arm angle with spin efficiency and you'll get an idea of how they interact to create different fastball shapes. For example, here's our average four-seam fastball across the board on a bunch of variables, including arm angle. Kodai Senga's four-seamer is a pretty good example of this. I'm sorry, Mets fans. Let's raise this slot to 50 degrees and then toggle up to 100% spin efficiency. This is Nick Mears' shape. Toggle down to 80% efficiency, so add more cut. The pitch will lose 5 inches of arm side movement, keep everything else the same, and you'll end up with Tanner Bibee's shape. Now let's shift down to a 30-degree arm angle with the same exercise. Everything else is at average, and you get Mitch Keller. Toggle up to 100% spin efficiency and you get something like Slade Cecconi's fastball. If you toggle down to 80% efficiency, you'll end up with Brian Bayo's fastball. I personally think the majority of understanding fastball shape comes down to where you land on these 2 variables. The peripheral variables that influence the movement of a four-seam fastball, or just pitches generally, are velocity, which we talked about earlier, and just the raw spin rate of the pitch. Now, velocity is going to contract movement, while spin rate, as you increase it, will also increase movement on a pitch. They are correlated to some extent. So as you throw harder, we generally expect you to spin the ball more. Most pitchers have a ratio, a spin to velocity ratio that we kind of can look at to understand how good they are at imparting force on the ball and creating that spin relative to the velocity band that they sit. We kind of understand the characteristics of shape and how we get to different shapes and how it describes the pitch, but what is actually good? Well, now's the perfect time to go back to Dylan Cease versus Rhett Lauder and plug in their variables. Cease sits 97.7, nearly 2,500 RPMs on his spin rate. He has dead average spin efficiency or cut, very high arm angle resulting in an above average release height. This is a great shape. It's a plus pitch. Lauder sits about 4 miles per hour lower than Dylan Cease, so 93.7 with 2,200 RPMs. He has very similar spin efficiency to Cease, sitting right around average, but he's also got a much lower arm angle and average release height. This nets out to a minus four-seamer, just not a very good pitch. So how would you make Lauder's four-seam fastball better? Maybe just add some velocity and spin, right? That's a clear separator from Cease, and it's a driving factor in a lot of fastball analysis. Well, per my stuff model, which is an attempt to predict a pitch's success based on the success of prior similar shapes, giving Lauder 2 miles per hour doesn't actually do that much. And this is because we haven't talked about release traits. The most visible public component of biomechanics, or the delivery of a pitcher in the public space, are release height, which is heavily connected to arm angle, and extension. Both of these variables are very much tied to how tall the pitcher is. And this is where Rhett Lauder is very limited. Increase his extension, lower his release height by a reasonable amount, and you can get him to an average four-seam fastball even when you leave his velocity and spin alone. You're probably starting to see how intertwined all this is, especially when you start to consider how a pitcher moves or their delivery. The problem is, in the public space, a lot of the statistics we use to grade out fastballs are at release. So we're getting kind of a snapshot of the result of everything happening earlier in a pitcher's chain and just kind of looking at what's happening at release. But I would argue a key component to adjusting a pitcher or considering how they can improve or get better has to do with everything prior to that point of release. You can't just go in, look at a pitcher and go, hey, drop your slot and add vert and cut the ball a bit more and boom, everything will work. That is a byproduct of everything happening earlier. I just think we're somewhat misrepresenting in the public space how the arm moves. It moves in three-dimensional space if you watch a pitcher throw, and yet we're kind of only looking at two-dimensional elements. So we publicly do have a bit of a limitation on how much I think we can understand pitchers' movements and how they result in pitch shapes. This kind of relates to what I was just doing with Rhett Lauder, give the guy a bigger stride, keep everything else the same, and poof, you have a better pitcher, you have a better four-seamer. Well, that's much easier said than done. Figuring out the range of outcomes around an adjustment is integral to developing pitchers and projections generally. I just finished covering my third MLB draft for NBC and MLB Network. I'll link to some of my clips of analysis in the video description if you want to check out my coverage. And this wondering about how to adjust a pitcher was constantly in my head during prep, looking at an entirely new universe of pitchers relative to the major leaguers and minor leaguers that I'm usually covering. How much velocity can USCR Mason Edwards, selected by the Athletics, add to protect what is a very curveball first profile? How does that impact his long-term chance of being a 120 inning starting pitcher? Same for Jackson Flores, selected 4th overall by the Giants. His fastball is pretty good, but talking to sources, there's a lot of concern about the playability of that pitch in MLB versus righties because he kind of cuts it more than average, which makes it more of a lefty weapon. When we look at what kinds of fastball shapes have platoon splits, so perform better against righties or lefties or a certain handedness, we find that slot really informs this. As a general rule, low slot four-seamers usually better against righties, high slot four-seamers generally better against lefties. And velocity is the great equalizer. Add velocity and platoon splits start to contract back to neutral. This leads us to the most popular trend in baseball right now, which is throwing multiple fastballs, or you'll often hear it called the 3-fastball approach. Is your four-seamer average? Well, you should probably throw 3 of them. Let's add a sinker, let's add a cutter. Is your four-seam really good? Yeah, you should probably also be throwing both a sinker and cutter on top of that good four-seam fastball. Based off all that information we were plugging into our tool, which I will also link to in the video description showing fastball shape, we can see what kind of sinker is average given the pitcher's four-seam fastball shape. The sinker shape is determined heavily by arm angle and also a pitcher's ability to cut the ball, or that concept of spin efficiency. When you cut the ball more, you're going to create more drop and separation from your four-seam fastball on this plot. So let's try to distill this all down. You want a synopsis of what makes a fastball good? You have to start with velocity because it buys you margin for error on everything else. Beyond that, what I think we're looking for in today's game is something that hitters don't normally see. My stuff model kind of backs this up from an arm angle standpoint. Watch how when I hold other traits constant and shift arm angle around, the stuff grade changes. Below 35 degrees, you're looking pretty good. Above 50 degrees, you also have a small window. If you're around average, you better be throwing hard or creating something off what hitters expect. And that expectation is where we tie things back to the movement of a pitch. My stuff model tends to like more efficient shapes because they generate miss more frequently. But cut the ball more, and you're more likely to have a large pitch package, strong breaking ball shapes, and thus your overall profile is probably less impacted by the quality of your four-seam fastball. You can see how there's multiple ways to succeed as a pitcher, and it's really a matter of understanding which path to go down in order to be good. So what's the one very, very obvious thing that I missed? Command. Let's talk about it. For a while, we've kind of been blind to what a pitcher's intent is, which is the ultimate way to grade command. But technology is getting really good, and maybe, just maybe, we'll get some of this info publicly soon. I saw this tweet on X from a user who I'm gonna guess his name Tom, about how he's using computer vision to back into a catcher's glove targets and then compare those glove targets relative to the end location of the pitch at the plate. There have also been some attempts on the public side to give location scores, which in a way are really just stuff models that you then layer in location of a pitch and see how the individual pitcher's results change. Top 5 four-seam location plus scores on Fangraphs this season for four-seamers, minimum 50 innings, are Kyle Harrison, Jake Bennett, Justin Wroblewski, Emerson Hancock, Bryce Miller. Pretty good list. I think it passes the sniff test. Driveline Baseball also has their own internal system based off Inside Edge's intended zone data that creates these pretty cool plots showing different kinds of command. They kind of break it down into accuracy and precision, which is a cool way to think about things. Accuracy is judging whether you're hitting an optimal target, so think the center of a dartboard, where precision is judging how consistently clustered your locations are, regardless of whether they're in the correct spot. Jack Lambert from Driveline posted a screenshot that showed their biggest accuracy improvers year over year. Tyler Glasnow is in there, so is Kyle Harrison. That's good cross-validation between sources. Spencer Arrighetti, Sandy Alcantara as well. Command is obviously an important part of what makes a fastball good. And at this point in the video, you might be surprised that I haven't brought up one of the more popular modern stats in pitching, vertical approach angle. Now, this was on purpose because you could probably do an entirely different video on VAA, but it is a composite of everything we just kind of talked about. And I'd argue it's useful, but only when you understand how the pitcher is getting to a flat VAA. And to do that, you need an understanding of everything we just talked about. Craig Kimbrell and Paul Sewald have the flattest approach angles on their four-seamers in Major League Baseball this season. Jacob Misiorowski, Emmett Sheehan are around there as well, but when you control for location, which is heavily influencing the vertical approach angle of a pitch, you could see that Misiorowski creates a flatter angle into the zone at any given location than a guy like Emmett Sheehan does by a pretty decent margin. So despite their raw vertical approach angle being essentially the same, Misiorowski has more of a skill to create a flat approach fastball. One of the problems with public analysis is that we desperately crave direct answers to questions like, would you rather have stuff or would you rather have command? When in lived reality, everything is going to exist on a spectrum. A pitcher is going to have a spectrum of velocity. Does he throw hard? Is it average? Is it not? That will help us understand how much margin for error you can buy in your delivery, your arm angle, the shape of the pitch, how much you cut the ball, all these other components. That's going to help us arrive at a stuff score. That stuff score is a North Star of sorts. It helps us understand or create an expectation around what we think a pitch will do in the major leagues. Now, of course, it's not perfect, but it's a guidepost. At that guidepost from there, you start to understand, okay, command, cutting the ball, how big will this repertoire be? How dependent will this pitcher be on their four-seam fastball? So this concept of what actually makes a fastball good is incredibly layered. But again, in looking at a pitcher for the first time, this is generally how I approach it. I try to think of all these components. I try to bucket the guy slightly, but I'm very aware that everything is going to exist on a spectrum. And I try to talk to people and understand which part of the spectrum can change the most to help influence the pitcher in a positive direction. Some of these traits are immutable, or at least more immutable than others. Spin efficiency, for example, is one that I do think is incredibly important to understanding the fingerprint of a pitcher. Talking to people in organizations, they're really prizing that cut because of how big you can get the pitch package, so to speak. While there's some organizations that really like that cut, there's other organizations that say they'd rather have the foundation of fastball success that is high efficiency, even if that means a shorter pitch package. At the major league level, perhaps that four-seam fastball can be relied upon more. So within my brain, there's separation, but within organizations, there's also different evaluation methods that help them arrive at what fastballs they think are actually good. So you can see how layered all of this is. But again, as I look at a pitcher for a first time, this is generally how I'm going to approach my analysis. And, every now and then it's good to do a very baseline level, first principles-y video of sorts to help me kind of gather my thoughts on what I've learned over the last couple of years. So I hope you enjoyed this. It was kind of a thought exercise for me to break down exactly what I'm doing when I look at a pitcher for the first time. And I hope you gleaned some information from it. Check out my Substack if you haven't already. I'll link to it in the video description. This tool that I was showing throughout this video is also in there. That's free for you to use. And my draft analysis on a bunch of names is also in the video description as well. I'll see you guys soon. Thank you.